carry a gun? He carried a pen. With an IQ of 141 and the smile of a polished lawyer, Arthur Seyss Inquart turned an entire nation into a mass grave. This is the story of the most terrifying intellectual monster Hitler ever owned. To the casual observer looking at grainy black and white archival footage from the late 1930s, Arthur Seyss Inquart did not fit the stereotypical terrifying mold of a Nazi henchman, nor did he seemingly possess the visceral thuggish aura typically required to orchestrate the systematic destruction of a sovereign nation. Unlike the other high-ranking architects of the Third Reich, he did not possess the flamboyant, drug-addled, and meta-laden ferocity of Hermann Göring, the venomous skeletal hysteria of the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, or the dark occult-obsessed mysticism that surrounded Heinrich Himmler. Instead, Seyss Inquart presented himself to the world with a disarming facade. He was a man of profound culture and intellect, a highly educated Viennese lawyer with a soft-spoken demeanor, a devout Catholic background that suggested moral rectitude, and a noticeable, pitiable limp, the lingering result of a mountaineering accident in the Austrian Alps, or perhaps a wound from the Great War, depending on which story one chose to believe at the time. Was a man who enjoyed the intricate complexities of classical music, who could quote German philosophy with ease, and who seemed to belong in the hushed, dusty aisles of a prestigious university library rather than standing atop a podium of skulls in a conquered land. However, this carefully cultivated veneer of civilization and bourgeois respectability was precisely what made him one of the Third Reich's most efficient, deceptive, and ultimately dangerous monsters. This chapter of history does not begin with a screaming demagogue inciting a mob in a beer hall, but with a quiet, bureaucratic determination in the refined coffee houses of Vienna, where hatred was discussed in hushed, polite tones over pastries and coffee. We must deeply explore the terrifying dissonance between his public persona as a respectable conservative statesman and his private, maniacal devotion to the radical, violent concept of a greater Germany. This was a man who did not view the violent absorption of Austria into Nazi Germany as a military conquest or a crime against sovereignty, but as a spiritual necessity, a mystical union of blood and soil that justified the suspension of all moral and legal laws. By examining his early life, his deep-seated, festering resentment against the Treaty of Versailles, which he believed had mutilated his homeland, and his seamless, almost invisible integration into the clandestine operations of the Austrian Nazi Party, we uncover a chilling truth that resonates through the decades: that the most effective architects of genocide are often not the ones holding the gun or the whip, but the ones writing the laws, signing the decrees and stamping the papers that make the gunfire legal. His story serves as a grim, essential testament to the fact that a calm, bureaucratic evil, one that operates through signatures, administrative memoranda, and legal loopholes, can be infinitely more destructive, more pervasive, and harder to resist than open, chaotic aggression. The question of treason versus patriotism is often a matter of perspective in the chaotic, shifting flux of politics. But in the case of Arthur Seyss Inquart, the betrayal of his homeland was methodical, calculated, and devastatingly complete. In the volatile, anxiety-ridden spring of 1938, lashed as the shadow of the swastika lengthened ominously across the German-Austrian border, Seyss Inquart played a pivotal, double-edged role that would seal Austria's fate for 7 dark years. He was not merely a passive bystander to the Anschluss. He was the Trojan horse invited into the highest levels of the Austrian government, a viper clutched to the bosom of the state he was sworn to protect. This section of our narrative dissects the high-stakes political poker game played between Vienna and Berlin, where Seyss Inquart served as Adolf Hitler's eyes, ears, and voice within the crumbling cabinet of Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg. We will analyze the frantic, sweat-drenched hours of March 11, 1938, a a day where diplomatic pressure turned into existential blackmail. While Schuschnigg desperately tried to save Austrian independence through a last-minute plebiscite, hoping to rally the people, Seyss Inquart was coordinating directly with Hermann Göring via telephone, undermining his own government from the inside with icy precision. The historical record shows that it was Seyss Inquart who, after being named chancellor for a mere matter of hours, following Schuschnigg's forced, tearful resignation, sent the infamous telegram message actually dictated to him, word for word by Berlin requesting German troops to enter Austria to restore order. In reality, there was no disorder to restore, only a sovereignty to be strangled by a foreign power. By exploring the legalistic maneuvers he employed to dismantle the Austrian state from the chancellor's desk, we see how he provided a veneer of legitimacy to a military invasion, proving his immense value to Hitler as a man who could dismantle a nation legally, quietly, and without a single shot being fired in defense. He believed he was saving Austria by erasing it from the map, a delusion that would propel him to even greater heights of power within the Nazi hierarchy, transforming him from a local lawyer into a titan of the Third Reich. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. For a dictator like Adolf Hitler, who viewed politics as a Darwinian struggle for survival, loyalty and competence were currencies more valuable than gold. And for his masterful, bloodless handling of the Austrian capitulation, Seyss Inquart was owed a significant reward. That reward came in the aftermath of the terrifying Blitzkrieg of May 1940, when the Wehrmacht crushed the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg in a matter of days, shattering their neutrality and leaving their cities in ruins. The prize bestowed upon the Austrian lawyer was the Reichskommissariat of the Netherlands, a position of absolute viceroy-like authority over a nation that was culturally and racially considered fraternal to the German people. This appointment was a strategic calculation by the Nazi leadership. They did not send a brute or a soldier to rule the Dutch. They sent an intellectual, a man of manners who could theoretically win over the Germanic population of the Netherlands to the National Socialist cause through persuasion rather than terror. We must cover the transition of Seyss Inquart from a provincial operator in Vienna to the absolute ruler of millions, setting the stage for a grotesque clash between his cultured civil appearance and the brutal, inhuman orders carried in his leather briefcase. Upon his arrival, he took residence not in a concrete military bunker, but in the elegant, aristocratic estates of Clingendale in The Hague, surrounding himself with fine art, expensive furniture, and the trappings of royalty. This chapter examines the psychology of his promotion. Here was a man who had failed to become a major political player in Free Austria, now given a kingdom of his own to mold in his image. The Dutch population, initially stunned by the speed of their defeat, the devastating bombing of Rotterdam, and the flight of Queen Wilhelmina to London, looked at this new Reichskommissar with a mixture of fear, confusion, and curiosity. Little did they know that the man who walked with a cane and spoke softly of blood ties and European unity was arriving with a mandate that would eventually strip their country of its wealth, its dignity, and the vast majority of its Jewish population, turning their picturesque canals and tulip fields into a landscape of terror. Why did the Dutch initially believe this Nazi overlord might actually be a reasonable man? Perhaps even someone they could work with to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The answer lies in Seyss Inquart's initial political strategy, a calculated deception that historians often refer to as the velvet glove approach. Upon assuming power, he did not immediately unleash the Gestapo in full force, nor did he dissolve the existing Dutch civil institutions overnight. Instead, he delivered a meticulously crafted inaugural speech at the Rittersaal Hall. The symbolic heart of Dutch politics and history that was masterful in its duplicity, standing before the conquered Dutch officials he promised to respect Dutch laws, to honor the unique Dutch national character, and to interfere as little as possible in the daily administrative lives of the citizens, provided they did not resist the German war effort against Britain. This segment examines the psychological manipulation at play. Seyss Inquart used flattery and the rhetoric of brotherhood to lull the population into a false sense of security, hoping they would self-nazify over time without the need for brute force. He kept the Dutch civil service largely intact, allowing mayors, police chiefs, and bureaucrats to keep their jobs and salaries, thereby making them complicit in the occupation regime that was slowly, imperceptibly tightening its grip. We will analyze how this strategy was designed to keep the country productive and docile, creating a dangerous normalization of the occupation in its early months. The velvet glove was not a gesture of kindness or mercy. It was a sedative administered to a patient before major surgery. Many Dutch citizens, seeing German soldiers paying for goods in shops and their new leader attending classical concerts, allowed themselves to hope that the occupation might be bearable, a form of soft totalitarianism. This miscalculation, fostered deliberately by Inquart's calm demeanor, would prove fatal as the months wore on, and the velvet was stripped away to reveal the iron fist of the SS beneath, ready to crush any dissent. How do you turn a free liberal society into a prison without firing a single shot in the streets? The answer lies in the weaponization of bureaucracy, a dark skill in which Inquart was a grand master without equal in the entire Nazi hierarchy. As the months of 1940 turned into 1941, the mask began to slip, not with a sudden explosion of random violence, but with a steady, suffocating drip of ink on paper. This chapter focuses on the administrative steps, the decrees,
The forms.
the mandatory registrations that systematically segregated the Dutch population and isolated the Jewish community from their neighbors. We will detail the introduction of the Aryan attestation Verklaring, a bureaucratic form that every civil servant, teacher, and public employee was required to sign, declaring formally whether they were Jewish or not. It seemed like a mere administrative formality to many at the time, right? A box to check to keep one's job, but it was the legal foundation of the Holocaust in the Netherlands. Seyss Inquart understood better than anyone that if you force people to categorize themselves, you can target them with surgical precision later. We will see how he subsequently fired Jewish civil servants, then banned Jews from public parks, cinemas, markets, and restaurants, slowly shrinking their world until they were invisible to their neighbors and socially dead before they were physically killed. This gradualism was the key to his success. By the time the Dutch population realized the full horrific extent of the anti-Semitic agenda, the legal and logistical trap had already snapped shut. This section emphasizes that the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with paperwork, managed by a man who viewed the elimination of a people not as a crime, but as a complex administrative problem to be solved with efficiency, organization, and legal decrees, proving that the pen can indeed be mightier and deadlier than the sword. There comes a specific moment in the history of oppression when the pressure becomes too great and a society snaps in defiance against its captors. In the Netherlands, that moment was the February strike of 1941. A singular and heroic event in the history of occupied Europe, when the Dutch people finally stood up to the Nazis, sparked by the brutal street beatings and violent roundups of their Jewish neighbors in the old Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. The response from Seyss Inquart was swift, shocked, and absolutely ruthless. This was the first and only massive open protest against the persecution of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, led by the communists and the tough dock workers who downed their tools and stopped the trams with the cry, "Stay off the Jews." This chapter details Seyss Inquart's furious reaction to this public defiance. The velvet glove was instantly discarded, revealing the tyrant within. He realized in that moment that the Dutch would not be seduced into National Socialism willingly, so they had to be broken by force. We will recount how he declared martial law, ordered the summary execution of the strike leaders at the Walsdorpervlicht, a dune area that became a site of tragedy, and dissolved the municipal councils of Amsterdam, replacing them with compliant collaborators. The repression was immediate, bloody, and publicly visible, signaling a definitive end to the phase of attempted seduction. Seyss Inquart's mask was now fully off. He proved that he was willing to use lethal force to maintain control, and that his primary loyalty was to the racial ideology of Berlin, not the welfare of the Dutch people he claimed to respect. This turning point is crucial to understanding his character. When his vanity was wounded by the Dutch rejection of his friendship, his response was to punish the entire nation with a ferocity that surprised even some of his German subordinates. Was Camp Westerbork, the most efficiently deceptive waiting room for death in all of Europe? As the deportations began in earnest in 1942, Seyss and Inquart oversaw the operation of Camp Westerbork, a transit camp located in the desolate peatlands of the northeastern Netherlands that served as the funnel for the Holocaust. We delve into the terrifying mechanics of this grim operation, specifically focusing on how Seyss and Inquart's administration made the deportation process run like a legitimate, scheduled business. Westerbork was not a death camp itself. It was a place of illusion, a Potemkin village of the Holocaust. It had a cabaret, a hospital with good equipment, a school for children, and even a camp currency, all designed to maintain order and keep the victims calm and hopeful before they were loaded onto the cattle cars heading east to Auschwitz and Sobibor. This chapter explains the dread of the Tuesday train schedule, a rhythmic horror that Seyss and Inquart insisted upon to meet the quotas set by Berlin. Every Tuesday, a train left with exactly 1,000 to 3,000 people, a schedule maintained with railway precision. We will analyze the relationship between Seyss and Inquart and the SS commanders who ran the camp, showing that while he may not have been the one pushing the prisoners onto the trains with rifle butts, he was the one ensuring the trains arrived on time, that the quotas were met, and that the police apparatus was sufficient to fill them. The efficiency of Westerbork was a direct reflection of Seyss and Inquart's governing style, orderly, deceptive, and lethal. He created a system where hope was weaponized against the victims, deceiving them until the very moment the doors were bolted shut, ensuring that the genocide proceeded with minimal resistance and maximum speed, a testament to the chilling effectiveness of his administrative evil. How much is a human life worth when neighbors are paid to hunt neighbors? As the war turned against Germany on the Eastern Front, and the final solution accelerated, Seyss and Inquart's regime introduced one of the most insidious systems of the occupation, the bounty system. This chapter covers the intensification of the raids razzias and the introduction of the Yellow Star, but it focuses specifically on the moral corruption of Dutch society orchestrated by the occupation authorities. We will discuss the Henite column, a group of Dutch collaborators and bounty hunters who were paid a specific sum, often 7.50 guilders per head, for every Jewish person they dragged out of hiding and turned in to the authorities. This monetization of human life was approved and facilitated by Seyss and Inquart's administration, creating a climate of terror where no attic, no cellar, and no secret room was truly safe. We must place the tragedy of iconic figures like Anne Frank into this broader context. Anne Frank and her family did not just disappear into the fog of war. They were hunted by a system designed by Seyss and Inquart to root out every last Jewish person from the Netherlands. This segment explores the relentlessness of the pursuit, showing that Seyss and Inquart was not content with merely deporting those who registered. He was determined to scour the country to achieve a Jew-free Netherlands, turning ordinary citizens into accomplices and destroying the social fabric of the nation in his fanatical pursuit of racial purity. The psychological toll of this betrayal, neighbor against neighbor, left scars on Dutch society that would last for generations. A direct result of policies signed at Seyss and Inquart's desk. Why did over 70% of Dutch Jews perish while their neighbors in France and Belgium survived at much higher rates? This is the damning statistical legacy of Arthur Seyss, a number that stands as an indictment of his effectiveness. We analyze the grim result of his efficiency. The Netherlands suffered the highest percentage of Jewish deaths in Western Europe, catastrophic loss compared to other occupied nations. This segment contrasts the Dutch geography, flat, open country without thick forests or mountains for hiding, with the zeal of Seyss and Inquart's administration. However, geography is only part of the story. The primary factor was the pre-war efficiency of the Dutch civil registry, which had been meticulously maintained, and which Seyss and Inquart hijacked for his genocidal purposes. We will explain how he utilized the work of the perfectionist Dutch bureaucrat Jacob Lens, whose foolproof ID card system became a death sentence for the Jewish population when placed in Nazi hands. While military governors in Belgium or France might have been corrupt, lazy, or inefficient, Seyss and Inquart was a micromanager and a perfectionist. He did not allow for exceptions. He did not accept bribes, pushed the machinery of death to its absolute limit. This chapter acts as a comparative analysis, proving that the personality and competence of the local Nazi administrator were often the deciding factors in the survival rates of Jewish populations across Europe. Seyss and Inquart's success in this regard is his most horrific crime, a demonstration of what happens when bureaucratic excellence is applied to mass murder. Can you imagine a cruelty so deep that a leader would starve millions of innocent civilians just to make a political point? As the Allies advanced in late 1944, following the failure of Operation Market Garden, the Dutch railway workers launched a heroic strike to hamper German movements and aid the liberation efforts. In retaliation, Seyss signed a horrific order that would define the end of the war for the Dutch memory. He blocked all food transport to the western provinces, effectively besieging his own subjects. This was not a military necessity. It was collective punishment, a tantrum of power. We plunge into the nightmare of the hunger winter, a period of man-made famine where millions of people in modern cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague were reduced to eating tulip bulbs, sugar beets, and even cats and dogs to survive. We will visualize the spectral images of emaciated children and the elderly collapsing in the frozen streets, digging through garbage, freezing to death in their unheated homes as the temperature plummeted. Nearly 20,000 to 22,000 people died from starvation and cold under Inquart's direct orders, while he sat in comfort mere kilometers away. This chapter highlights the sheer spitefulness of the act. Even as the Reich was crumbling, Inquart prioritized the suffering of the civilians over any strategic logic. It was a final act of vengeance against a people who had refused to love him, demonstrating a level of callousness that rivals the worst atrocities of the 20th century. The images of the hunger winter remained the most potent symbol of his cruelty, a reminder of the price paid by the innocent for the ego of a tyrant. Not content with taking their lives, he stripped the very gears of their industry to feed the dying German war machine. Beyond the starvation, Inquart oversaw the systematic looting of the Netherlands, a process that accelerated frantically as the German situation became desperate. This chapter details the Arbeitsinsaats, forced labor, where hundreds of thousands of Dutch men, fathers, sons, brothers were rounded up in massive raids and deported to German factories to replace the workers sent to the meat grinder of the front lines. We will examine the Sokol actions, named after the General Plenipotentiary for labor deployment, but implemented ruthlessly by Inquart's police forces. But it wasn't just labor. Was everything not nailed down. We will recount how church bells were melted down for weapons, how millions of bicycles were confiscated, leaving the streets silent, and how radio sets were seized to prevent the Dutch from listening to the Hope, broadcast by the BBC. The looting extended to art, industrial machinery, locomotives, and raw materials. Inquart presided over the hollowing out of the Dutch economy, treating the nation not as a territory to be governed, but as a warehouse to be raided and left empty. This systematic theft left the Netherlands destitute and broken by the time liberation finally arrived, creating economic scars that would take decades to heal. It reinforces the image of Inquart as a rapacious colonial governor, stripping the province bare for the benefit of the motherland, till the very end, ensuring that even if Germany lost the war, the Netherlands would not easily win the peace. If he could not rule the Netherlands, was he determined to ensure no one else could either? In the apocalyptic final days of the war, seemingly out of spite and adherence to Hitler's Nero decree, Inquart ordered the destruction of vital infrastructure. The most heinous of these acts was the flooding of the Wieringermeer polder, a fertile agricultural area. We visualize the senseless destruction as German engineers blew up the dikes, allowing the sea to rush back into lands that had been painstakingly reclaimed from the ocean over centuries. Villages were submerged, crops were ruined, and the geography of the country was physically altered in an act of ecological vandalism. This chapter analyzes the nihilism of these final orders. There was no military advantage to be gained. The Allies were already winning, and the war was lost. This was destruction for destruction's sake, a man willing to drown a country he could no longer possess. It serves as the ultimate metaphor for his rule, a flood that engulfed the nation, destroying the structures of civilization. We will also touch upon the tense negotiations in the final weeks, where Inquart, realizing the end was near, partially refrained from some final destructive orders, only to secure better terms. For his own safety, a final act of self-serving calculation amidst the ruin he created. This duality, the destroyer who negotiates, reveals the core of his survival instinct, willing to burn the world down but hoping to save himself from the ashes. Where does the perfect bureaucrat run when the paperwork finally runs out and the armies of retribution arrive? As the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash in May 1945, Seyss Inquart attempted to flee the scene of his crimes, seeking a way to survive the cataclysm. He did not die in a bunker like Hitler, or take poison like Himmler. True to his nature, he tried to navigate the situation politically to the very last second. We recount his flight to Flensburg to meet with Admiral Dönitz, the new head of the German state, hoping perhaps for a new position in a successor government or a diplomatic way out. However, the net was closing tight. We describe his capture by Canadian forces at a bridge in Hamburg. It was an undignified end for the Reichskommissar. Stripped of his uniform's immense power, he was just another middle-aged man with a limp. Standing in the rain, surrounded by the young soldiers of the liberating armies, who likely had no idea of the sheer scale of the evil this man had authorized. This moment marks the transition from absolute power to absolute accountability. The man who had signed thousands of death warrants was now a prisoner himself. Stripped of his luxury, his stolen art collections, and his authority, left to face the justice of the nations he had tormented. The image of him standing there, powerless and ordinary, serves as a stark contrast to the terror he once commanded. Did he truly believe that signing execution orders was just administrative work, or was it a final mask to hide his guilt? Standing trial at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, Seyss Inquart reverted to his lawyer persona, presenting a defense that was chilling in its detachment and legalistic precision. This chapter dissects his cold, emotionless performance in the courtroom. He did not rant or rave like some of his co-defendants. He argued legalities, jurisdictions, and technicalities. He claimed he was merely an administrator following orders, a buffer who had actually mitigated Hitler's harshest commands to save the Dutch from even worse fates, a claim that insulted the memory of the dead. We will examine the absurdity of this defense against the mountain of evidence regarding the Holocaust, the deportations, and the Hunger Winter. We will highlight the results of the IQ tests administered to the Nazi defendants, in which Seyss Inquart scored credibly high 1-for-1, proving that his crimes were not born of stupidity, ignorance, or brainwashing, but of a highly intelligent, conscious choice to serve evil. His testimony serves as a prime example of the banality of evil. A man who could articulate complex legal arguments while standing amidst the ghosts of millions. He admitted to nothing of substance, showing no remorse, maintaining his facade of the dutiful civil servant to the bitter end, believing perhaps that his intellect could outmaneuver the judgment of history. Does the hangman's noose finally balance the scales for a nation starved and shattered? The documentary concludes with the tribunal's inevitable and just judgment. Arthur Seyss Inquart was found guilty on counts of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. There was no leniency for the man who had strangled Austria and starved the Netherlands. We describe his execution by hanging on October 16, 1946, in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. His final words, proclaiming his hope for peace, rang hollow against the backdrop of the suffering he had caused. As the trapdoor opened, the life of the polite monster was extinguished, serving as the final closure to the darkest chapter in Dutch history. We end with a reflection on his legacy. Seyss Inquart stands as a terrifying warning to history that education, culture, and civilized manners are no barrier to barbarism. He showed the world that the most dangerous villains are not always the ones with blood on their hands, but the ones with ink on their fingers who sit at clean desks and sign away the lives of millions with a stroke of a pen. His story challenges us to look beyond the surface of authority and recognize the potential for evil lurking within the bureaucracy of tyranny, reminding us that vigilance is the price of liberty and that the quietest monsters are often the most deadly.